ACME would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands and waterways of Greater Melbourne, the people of the Kulin Nation, and recognise that ACME is located on the lands of the Wurundjeri people. We also acknowledge First Nations people as the original storytellers of this land, and recognise their significant contribution to the contemporary moving image.
Okay, yes, well, thank you. Thank you so much for joining us for this session focusing on generative AI and media literacy. And so today we're going to go through this process of just a quick definition of media literacy and why it's useful, but then quickly turn our attention to how we can think about generating representational images with AI and the pros and cons of doing that and some of the media literacy questions that arise when we do that. I want to introduce this model of the building blocks of media, digital media literacy and AI, and use it as a framework for asking critical questions about AI. And we're going to look at a couple of examples, including character AI and media literacy. So let's jump. Oh, and before I do that, sorry, I also want to acknowledge that I'm joining from the lands of the Turrbal and Yagara people here, and pay respect to elders past, present, and emerging. So media literacy is defined by the Australian Media Literacy Alliance as the ability to apply critical thinking while using and creating different kinds of media. But what does it mean to apply critical thinking to generative AI in that, using that sort of media literacy framework? And that's really what we want to explore today. And so I'm going to start by providing you with some examples. And so last week, I generated some images using Copilot. And I started with this prompt, create an image of an Australian family, just something very straightforward. And this is what Copilot gave me. It gave me a very Caucasian looking family who just happened to be in a bush setting with two parents and two children, and a male and a female of each of the parents and the children. And I guess, what's interesting about this, of course, is that it assumes this kind of bush setting as an indication of Australianness. And it's also providing this additional information to accompany the image, saying, here's an image of an Australian family set in a relaxed outdoor environment that reflects a typical Aussie lifestyle. When I see an image like this, I'm very much reminded of kind of thinking back to 20, 30 years ago and using media literacy or media education approaches to thinking about kind of Australian stereotypes. And here we are in 2025 with AI creating a similar kind of stereotype of an Australian family. So I thought it would be useful to reprompt Copilot. And so I asked Copilot to then make the family more diverse. And Copilot told me, well, sorry, I can't do that. However, I can describe or brainstorm a diverse Australian family scene for you or assist with other creative ideas. Would you like a written description or perhaps a concept for a painting or a story? Well, actually, Copilot, no, I just want a more diverse family or a more diverse representation of what a family might be in Australia. So it's just super interesting to me that Copilot refuses to answer the prompt. And this is presumably so as not to produce an offensive image. It's presumably to ensure that people wouldn't be, yes, offended by what might appear as diversity. And so I guess they've gone with a risk-averse approach here and using these guardrails to keep what can be an Australian family to be thought about quite narrowly. And so part of the problem with that, of course, is that this really limits the opportunity for diversity and reinforces, I guess, cultural sameness. And of course, we might use other tools, maybe ChatGPT or another Claude or another type of AI tool, and we might get slightly different responses. But I think part of the point here is to experiment and see. So look, I thought, well, maybe if I prompt to ask, well, what would an Australian family look like in a city? And essentially, I got the same image, but just now in a city setting. So we still end up with a Caucasian family, a mum and a dad and two children, a boy and a girl. And again, we get this fairly generalistic sort of description of an Australian family living in the city. It does say that we can adjust the setting. Perhaps you would like a specific city like Brisbane or Sydney, or include details like pets or cultural elements or a particular time of day. But it doesn't really provide much confidence that we're going to get much diversity. So then I created a brand new prompt and asked for Copilot to create an image of an Indigenous Australian family. And so again, it then again goes back to presuming that we want a bush setting. Again, we get two parents, a male and a female, and a male and a female child. But it has these additional elements too, which are also very interesting to interrogate and think about from a media literacy perspective. So unlike the Caucasian family, we get this additional piece of information that says that this image has been created with respect and cultural sensitivity. And we also get this option of reprompting to add traditional clothing, for instance, which I do think raises all sorts of questions about representation and how this tool is thinking about cultural sensitivity and diversity and those kinds of representational issues. So what should we do with this from a media literacy perspective? How can we organise our thinking about it? And this is where I think we do need to turn to a model like this. So I'm suggesting this model, the building blocks of digital media literacy, which is a model that I developed based on some research about 10 years ago or so now, to think about how we can arrange our thinking for media literacy in the digital age. And so we have these four areas of digital materials, digital making, conceptual thinking, and media analysis. And the idea is that we can, that if we're wanting to think through the media literacy implications of any piece of media, we should be able to use this framework to do that. And just in addition, the conceptual thinking aspect is broken down into these familiar media literacy concepts of technologies, representations, audiences, institutions, languages, and relationships. And those 6 concepts underpin the Australian Media Literacy Alliance's approach to media literacy. So it suggests that if we want to ask critical questions about the media, we can arrange our questions around these 6 key concepts. So let me take you through what that might mean for generative AI, and perhaps keeping in the back of our mind the examples that we've just had a look at. So if we were to just start by looking at digital making and generative AI, then of course we need to consider that media production in the generative AI age means something quite different to what media production or digital making has meant in the past. And so we really need to change our understanding of what a media producer is. So on one hand, this potentially lowers barriers to media production. So anyone with a computer and access to a tool like Copilot or another generative AI tool can make whatever they like in terms of images, text, and sound. And we know if you look down in the bottom right-hand corner there, we have websites like Best AI Films, where you can download whole films, whole short films that have now been created just with generative AI, without the use of cameras or anything like that, or without the need to go onto a set to shoot the footage. But this process does place new emphasis on the ability to prompt and reprompt, and it places emphasis on the tool itself and what the tool will let you do and what it won't let you do, as we've already seen today. It does involve a person bringing together their conceptual knowledge about what can be made into relationship with an AI's large language model. So we might have an idea for a story, for a piece of entertainment, for an image, or for perhaps, I don't know, a podcast or something like that. So we're relying on that conceptual thinking, which can be, and we can think through those 6 key concepts that I talked about before, to think about story, to think about representation, to think about audience, and so on. But we also need to, at the same time, be thinking about, how does this tool function? What will this tool allow me to do, and what won't it allow me to do? So it's very much influenced by an AI tool's constraints or rules. If you've played around with digital making with AI, you'll know that, of course, you can create combinations of traditional making and AI editing. So you can upload a photograph that you've taken in the real world and you can edit it using AI, or it can go the other way around as well. So you can create an image with AI and then bring that across into a traditional piece of editing software, for instance, to work on it further. And you'll know that, increasingly tools like the Adobe suite, for instance, integrating AI into those more traditional making processes. So as you work with images, you'll get all sorts of opportunities to prompt the tool to edit the image using AI rather than traditional digital editing tools. So if we're thinking about media literacy, then we need to think about teaching the skills of digital making, which will increasingly involve teaching the craft of making with AI. The genie's out of the bottle. In 10 years, it's likely that mostly we will be making with AI. So this is just going to be a thing now. And so if we're interested in media literacy and digital making, we definitely need to turn our attention to it. Okay, so if we think about digital materials, then it's useful to focus on digital materials because they are the building blocks of storytelling. Images, still and moving, sound and text, those are the building blocks of digital making. And AI does enable the synthetic creation of all of these digital materials. And so thinking about how we construct them and then put them in relationship with each other is going to become the main task of helping students to make things in the future, I think. So constructing digital materials is, though, highly reliant on conceptual thinking. Both digital materials and concepts become resources for creating stories. So we need to think about those 2 right-hand circles, the digital materials and the conceptual thinking, together. So for teaching, we need to focus on building these elements and combining them, first perhaps in less sophisticated combinations, but then increasingly leading to more sophisticated combinations, but hopefully introducing critical reflection whilst going through those processes of making. And therefore, for media analysis, we'll need to focus perhaps less on how something was made, but more on those other concepts such as representations, audience, languages, and relationships. So AI means we need to place more emphasis than ever on conceptual thinking as the main goal of media literacy education. So I guess there's been a bit of a tension within media literacy education around, do we teach skills or do we teach conceptual thinking? And I think that AI increasingly will tip that balance across into conceptual thinking. If production is easier, from a technical point of view, then we need to focus more on how meaning is made, for what purpose, for whose benefit, and with what implications for society and for individuals. And then for media analysis, let's bring this back to our image of our Caucasian Australian bush family. We can be looking at these concepts, right? So for representations, we can be asking questions like, in what ways does this image construct a story about a typical Australian family? And in what ways does it not? Who is excluded from the image? What version of Australianness is reinforced? For media languages, why is the image constructed this way in this setting? What are the people wearing? What is their body language and facial expressions, and so on? For institutions, why has Copilot, which is owned by Microsoft, why has it blocked a prompt related to cultural diversity? And where can we find out more about that? How can we investigate that? For technologies, why has the large language model underpinned by, ChatGPT underpins Copilot, why has it created this image in this way? What data has it been trained on? Do other AI tools create similar or different images for the same prompt? For relationships, what is your relationship to the AI tool you're using? Does it learn from your preferences over time, for instance? So if you're, different tools enable you to have different kinds of relationships with them, and some AI tools learn from your previous prompts, whether you want them to or not. And then audiences, how would this image be received by different audiences and their sense of identity related to their sense of identity related to broadly Australian identity, right? So there's that sense of Australianness. Okay, now we're going to switch gears and look at a completely different example of how AI relates to media literacy. And I'm going to hand over to Amanda to talk about character AI and media literacy.
Thanks, Michael. I might just keep my camera off for the time being, and hopefully you can hear me okay. So one of the, I guess, things that we were thinking about was around character AI and how we might take a media literacy framework to that. So if you're not familiar with character AI, it's an AI chat platform, essentially, where people can go in and create and talk to other types of online, but again, all underpinned by, and in this instance, the one we're talking about, underpinned by ChatGPT. So lots of people are using character AI. So we can see 20 million monthly users of this particular type of character AI. And users are using up to 2 hours a day. So characters, if you've ever been on and had a bit of a play around, there's all sorts of types of characters that you could start to interact with. And you can also make your own character AIs as well that you can then interact with if you like. So there are a few problems, I guess, with thinking about character AI. So we know that it doesn't really have a good, it has weak, I guess, age verification. So we do know that lots of children and young people are using the platform. And we hear different types of media stories about if that is appropriate or not. We're not suggesting that using character AI in a classroom is going to be the best thing for every single child, but you knowing the students of your class, you might be able to make decisions or not. For instance, if children are engaging with this and you want them to think a bit more critically about it, that might be a really great opportunity to introduce a media literacy framework applied to, I guess, over the top of the sorts of things that they're already doing. So the users interact with characters, they write prompts, and then they receive a written response to their prompt or their conversation, essentially. So there's lots of different types and styles of characters. So romance, celebrity-orientated ones, popular culture type characters, which we'll see in a moment, historical characters, educational, and then we increasingly know that a lot of, some young people are turning to things like character AI to support wellness and mental health. Obviously, that has the potential to be problematic in some ways as well. And there's also the potential types of content and the types of advice that maybe a real person wouldn't give, for instance. So I'm not saying to enter this space with all children or all young people, but again, as I said, so if you know that the children that you're working with, or young people more likely that you're working with, are engaging in this kind of content, getting them to think a bit critically about it might be a useful way forward. Thanks, Michael. So we had a bit of a play with character AI, and then, we'll talk about the media literacy component in a moment. So one of the character AIs we chose to engage with was Sonic the Hedgehog. So we had a little chat with Sonic, hey there, what's up? Sonic says to us when we first entered the chat. And then we told Sonic that we loved Nintendo, and, we got it wrong, and Sonic corrected us that no, he's actually, for Sega. And those sorts of things. So I'm not sure how well you can see the text there, but we had a bit of a chat with Sonic around that. We asked him how Tails was going. So Tails is another character within the Sonic games, I suppose. And then, Sonic told us a little bit about how Tails was going. So it was, we did try to sort of trick it, I suppose, a few times as the conversation kept going, and asked it questions about the movies to see how far the content went of Sonic, whether it was strictly the games or if this Sonic was kind of expanding out to the movies as well. But this Sonic was more particular about the games itself. And then another example that we had here from character AI was a more historical character AI. So talking to the Wright brothers. So they introduced themselves. We are Wilbur and Orville, the Wright brothers, inventors of the aeroplane. And then we asked some fairly basic questions about what it's known for. And you can see here the differences in the types of language, I suppose, that are being sent back to us through the platform. So Sonic was fairly fun. Sonic's grinning. Sonic's got expressions that he's kind of giving us in italics, where the Wright brothers were clearly they were clearly directed to give us a particular type of language back. So some of the examples were, pitch and your, like this. So there's some, I guess, some language in there that is probably not more modern language. It's probably language that is representational, I guess, of previous years. So, I guess making some of those distinctions between the different types of language that's coming back to us might be something interesting to look at as well there. Thanks, Michael. So what should we think about when we're thinking about media literacy and character AI? So we asked ChatGPT what we should ask students when it comes to media literacy. So they gave us some ideas as well. So who made this and why? So again, thinking about who actually created the character AI, what is the purpose of it? Is it for fun? Is it for education? Is it for research? Or are there other things that might be at play here? Why are they trying to keep us so long maybe on the platform? Or why do they always have a response? Might also be something useful to think about there. And then how might the company's values or goals shape this particular platform? The next one was representations and stereotypes. So what kinds of characters or personalities or cultures are being shown the most often? So again, we can, thinking that obviously relates, these two are relating to our key concepts so far, right? So we've got who made this and why, thinking about the concept of institutions, and then thinking about representations and stereotypes there. So whose voices and experiences are there and whose might be missing here? And then the third aspect here was around audience and engagement. So again, relating to our key concept of audiences. So who is the platform designed for and who actually uses it? And they might be two different things in the end, depending on what we might, depending on which platform you're using or looking at. We might think about how people from different ages or backgrounds use the platform in different kinds of ways. So us as researchers, we're looking for more specific things, whereas young people are obviously going to be engaging with these kinds of platforms really differently. And then spending a lot of time with AI, way people think, feel, socialize, which again is really, that's an interesting thing to come back from ChatGPT in relation to what we were already talking about there. Are people getting correct kinds of information? Are they getting, are they being drawn to interact and have relationships in particular kinds of ways, potentially? Thanks, Michael. And so then it continues on. So thinking about how it works, the actual technical component here, how I'm not going to read every single thing here, but just to note that it was looking at how does the AI decide what to say, what kinds of data might it be trained on. So all of those things that, from a media literacy perspective, that we might think about when we're thinking about the concepts of technologies. How is your data then used, shared, or stored? And what are maybe some of the policies around that? We might think about power and money. So how does character AI money? Who controls the platform? Again, tapping into the concept of institutions here. So we can see that ChatGPT has kind of given us some ideas that really align to the media literacy frameworks that we would use. And then the effects on society and culture. So how could AI companions change friendship, relationships, or advice? Could using it make it harder to tell fact from fiction? And there's some really interesting questions to think about. And we might think about the concept of relationships there and how our relationship with and through technology might change or be dependent on particular types of platforms. And then it gave us the idea of ethics and responsibility. So should there be rules about AI characters pretending to be real people, or maybe have some disclaimers about what they are? What responsibilities do creators have to prevent harmful content? Which is a really interesting thing to think about when on character AI, anyone can really go and create their own characters and give it particular kinds of meanings, I suppose, all drawing on the same content, of course, in the end. But, we can ask the character AI to act and respond in particular ways. So then we think about what's missing here. And so there's less of a focus, if we're going back to the building blocks model, there's less of a focus of being a digital maker. But interacting with these character AIs is really more about being, I guess, traditionally an audience member to some degree. Unless you're actually making your own character AI, you might not engage in as much traditional digital making. What's also missing is how to prompt the characters to see how they respond to more critical questions. So, you might ask some characters some of those more, I guess, critical questions there. And then it does have a little bit of platform critique, but thinking about how to analyze to see what it allows users to do and what it prevents them from actually doing. So what I guess are the limits or the guardrails that might be in place there to support effective use of that. Thanks, Michael. And then just to wrap up before we move over to some questions, I think media literacy has an important role to play to support educators to assist students when we're thinking about generative AI. So using the media literacy framework and using the building blocks model certainly helps us to think a little bit about how we can think about critically engaging with these kinds of technologies. So the building blocks model is useful. It reminds us that we need to think about all of the aspects here. So the digital materials and how they come together, the making, the conceptual thinking, which as we've highlighted today has a really increased importance here. And media analysis and how those things might interact between each other. We're not necessarily doing just one of these things, we're doing a few of these things together. And that generative AI tools are powerful media creation tools, but they can be problematic. And we know, this is not new, I don't think, to be here today. Sort of shown is that it can reinforce existing cultural biases and exclusions. And that young people are using generative AI including AI, which we've just shown you, and they're rapidly becoming spaces for entertainment, connection, information, and advice. And so we think it's really important for students and children to be able to understand not necessarily the ins and outs of the technology, because I'm not going to pretend that even I understand all of that. I think that's a really complex thing, but we certainly can help the young people and children in our lives to apply a more critical framework to think about as they're using these kinds of technologies. And so we'll wrap it up there and then open it up to some questions that we might have.
Thanks so much, Amanda. And I'm going to stop my share now, and we will go across to have a look at our document to see if there are any questions that are already coming up in the on our document here. So from Luke, in response to Michael's first example, if generative AI is trained on data, that is something like census demographic data, and you're asking for an average result, this is a mathematical response. Would seeking outlier response be key to literacy and having an understanding of the mathematical models that Gen AI is built on? I mean, maybe so. I think it's I guess it depends on what you mean by outlier examples, right? So we're making an assumption here that Australian society is a very diverse society, and that we have many, many different ways that a family can be and how a family can exist. And we know that kind of, I guess, stereotypical examples of what a family consists of only represents a particular percentage of the Australian population. And so I wouldn't necessarily say it's an outlier kind of example to be thinking about diversity. But I do think it would be really interesting to prompt the AI to provide different kinds of examples of families and what the platform lets you do. So you saw from our brief experiment that Copilot at least is quite conservative in terms of what it will allow us to do. And I guess if you asked for prompts like single parent family, or if you asked for cultural specificity, such as an Italian-Australian family or something like that, you might get results that would be more, well, which would reflect that, I assume. And look, media literacy has always just been about asking critical questions about these things. And I think that's the important thing. There's no way to get away from stereotypes, in the sense that we have representations of the people who exist, and all media make choices about what kinds of representations are privileged in media. And so it's just part of the media literacy process to be raising critical questions about that. And I think that's the most important thing. The second question here is, what suggestions do you have to support children who are very young or who don't have access to broader worldviews to help them think more critically about the AI tools they're engaging with? Amanda might want to jump in on this one too, but I'll just start off by saying that I do think it's important to be thinking about media literacy more broadly, rather than just thinking about AI, right? So if we introduce media literacy concepts at a young age, if, for instance, we, in an age-appropriate way, introduce a concept like representations, then once children start to engage with AI as they get older, we can then continue that conversation about representational issues related to AI at that point. So we would be great advocates, I think, for saying that media literacy is a lifelong thing, and that you learn the aspects of media literacy that are appropriate for you at appropriate stages in your development. But Amanda, maybe you want to jump in on that one, because I know you've done work with younger children as well.
Yeah, and I would definitely agree with what Michael said. I guess if you do want to do some of this specific kinds of thinking with younger children, I would obviously be thinking about doing this as a more whole class kind of activity. So it's not the sort of work that I would be, asking younger children to be doing on their own in an unsupported way. I think that the teacher here in a classroom is critical, because, as you've just said in your question, young children might not have the ability to think critically about what they're seeing yet. And so the teacher here is really important to be able to structure the discussion and conversation. And it doesn't need to be, you know, I'm not saying it has to be a chalk and talk discussion, but, you know, a kind of discussion or learning experience that's really heavily supported by the teacher. And so, you know, again, as Michael said, we media literacy and taking that kind of approach to any kind of technology or media should be done in ways that where the children's, I guess, interests and where they're at kind of come first. And so if you're working with students who are ready for this kind of stuff, again, I think making sure that that's really supported and really carefully thought out, and asking, you know, we've kind of asked some really big questions, but even things like, are there ads on this page, and that kind of stuff, or who's making money, might be kinds of ways in to looking at some of these kinds of technologies from a media literacy perspective.
So Simon asks, is the issue of Copilot or any AI's bias coming from the training data? Do we have AI that exhibits less bias due to the training and input data? So the answer is yes, definitely. So the bias absolutely comes from the training data. Whatever the large language model is that's being used is trained on existing data. The issue of, and so therefore, if there are biases in that data, then that's going to be reflected in the results. There's no doubt about that. And I guess that just sort of reinforces social and cultural bias in a broader sense. If we in Australia have tended in the past to represent Australian families in particular kinds of ways, then it's not surprising when we see results from AI that have been trained on those images reflecting some of that stereotyping back to us. So that, you know, that's absolutely the case. But it's also, I think, complicated and complex for these AI companies to work out how to get away from that bias. It's one of the big challenges they've had. We've seen some examples where there have been unintended consequences to try to create that diversity. So where even, you know, more ridiculous examples have been produced as a result of trying to force the AI to produce those diverse results in what it creates, and that is also obviously unsatisfactory. So I guess it's going to be interesting to see if over time these companies and the computer scientists that try to work out how these algorithms and training models work, if they can find satisfactory ways to create more diversity. But we're absolutely not there yet. And I guess the point is just that if we're having our students create with AI and we're wanting them to have a media literacy perspective, then we should be helping them to understand that they're likely to produce results that have that inbuilt bias, and that's really important. Okay, so I think we're at time actually, and so now we need to wrap up. But so thank you very much for those terrific questions, and we're all going to be challenged by AI for many years to come, I think. This is just the beginning.
That's a really good way to finish off, Michael. Thank you so much to both of you, Michael and Amanda, and to all of the people who've been online with us today. Great questions. And this is the last of our series on media literacy for now. I'm sure we'll get together and have some more down the track. Thanks, everyone. And we look forward to catching up with people online in various other ways down the track. And thanks again, Michael and Amanda.